Dr. Pamela S. Nadell holds the Patrick Clendenin Chair in Women's and is professor and chair of the Department of History and director of the Jewish Studies program at American University. So how could you talk about the history of women of Reform Judaism without her? Her 6 books include Women Who Would Be Rabbis, A History of Women's Ordination, 1889 to 1985, and the recently published Making Women's Histories Beyond National Perspectives. Now, on a personal note, I'll forgive the degrees from Ohio State as I am a Michigan graduate. It's okay. Her presentation today is called The Synagogue Shall Hear the Call of the Sister, looking back at the founding of the National Federation of Temple Sisterhoods. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Pamela Nadell.
This is an incredible time to be a historian working especially on the topic of American Jewish women, because so many Jewish women's organizations, national Jewish women's organizations, were founded in the 19-teens and the 1920s. But the first large one, even though I'll say something about one of the others in a couple of minutes, the first large one in the 19-teens was the National Federation of Temple Sisterhoods. And as you know, later this year at the biennial, there will be a new book, Sisterhood, A Centennial History of Women of Reform Judaism, and all of us who've been invited to present today have contributed to that book, and you'll be hearing about some of the things that we've wrote and some of the things we've written, and we're really excited to have so many people interested in what we do, which is looking back at the past. So that's what I want to do now, is I want to take you back to a century ago, to a time long before there were the women of Reform Judaism, to the days when the ladies of the sisterhood founded the National Federation of Temple Sisterhoods. I want to start us off by going back to December 13th, 1912, when Julius Walter Freiberg, president of the Union of American Hebrew Congregations, which you all know is what URJ used to be called, he called all the ladies' organizations connected with congregations belonging to the Union, and he asked them to send delegates to their meeting in Cincinnati only 5 weeks later, and they should found there a Federation of Temple Sisterhoods. But those of us who've spent time reading what is written in this book know that to put together such a sophisticated meeting in 5 weeks, especially pre-internet age, would not have been possible. So my question this morning is why? Why, 40 years after founding the Union, did the Union decide that it was time to organize these ladies of the sisterhood? And our answer lies in the life and avocation of Carrie Obendorfer Simon. And I should tell you that she was known then, and she signed every single article she wrote as Mrs. Abram Simon. So, but we're going to call her Carrie. That was actually something we discussed when we were writing the book, is how do we refer to these women, because they referred to themselves as Mrs. Abram Simon or Mrs. something. So what convinced Carrie Simon in January 1913 was the moment for the synagogue to hear the call of the sister. And I didn't misspell that. That's how that she wrote it. So I don't want you to think I don't know how to spell. So our answer takes us back even further to the 19th century, when some of the 52 ladies' temple aid societies, which answered the Union's call, were first established. So in the 19th century, American women engaged in something that was called benevolent work. And Carrie Simon actually wrote about that benevolent work. She wrote about it in a publication called The American Jewess. It was the first American Jewish women's magazine. Didn't last very long. And she called that benevolent work like a sun shedding rays of light where shadow and darkness prevailed. So we know what American Christian women were doing in terms of benevolent work. They sent missionaries to China. They helped their ministers in their churches. They were trying to shut down all the saloons in America. That would eventually lead to prohibition. They were rescuing fallen women. That was their words. what were American Jewish women in the 19th century doing? Well, they were creating Frauenverein, essentially ladies' temple aid societies. After the Civil War, Christian women's national organizing exploded. The Women's Christian Temperance Union was founded in the 1870s. It had 200,000 members. And of course, the American Jewess, what did it say about that when it was when it asked Jewish women to join the Women's Christian Temperance movement? It said the word Christian is too narrow a sphere. So in 1893, this is 20 years after the Women's Christian Temperance Union. In 1893, at a big conference, a big centennial, I don't even know the word for this huge fair in Chicago, the Columbian Exposition. At that Columbian Exposition, the first significant Jewish women's organization was founded, the National Council of Jewish Women. Its founding president, Hannah Solomon, was of course a member of Reform Synagogue, and it was founded to unite women under the umbrellas of religion, philanthropy, and education. And this is one of my favorite photos of it. This is actually from the National Museum of American Jewish History. So I like it because it shows you very much, first of all, what they looked like back then, and how they dressed. Look how different we're dressed today. So for 20 years, the National Council of Jewish Women was the only Jewish women's organization, National Jewish Women's Organization. But by 1912, Council was in trouble. That trouble revealed the reality that American Jewish women then and today were not monolithic, and that there was tremendous diversity among American Jewish women. And that diversity is what led in the 19-teens and the 1920s to a burst of founding of new Jewish women's organizations. I should mention, just so you have a sense of what I'm talking about, Hadassah, 1912, National Federation of Temple Sisterhoods, 1913, the other sisterhood organizations, the Conservative and the Orthodox in addition to the Reform, and then a number of also Zionist organizations, and that's only some of them. So what was causing Council's troubles in 1912? There were a number of issues which I don't have time to discuss, but the big one seems to be that Council was moving away from religion and towards social service. And in fact, Philadelphia's Rabbi Joseph Krauskopf knew this when he complained that there was a board member of the National Council of Jewish Women who, rather than belonging to a temple, went to services in a Unitarian church. And the dissatisfactions, not particularly over that one, but the other dissatisfactions, which, as you can imagine, not surprisingly had to do in part with money, were so upsetting to many of the members and the local chapters of the National Council that Rabbi Krauskopf's wife, Sybil, who, by the way, I could not get a photo of, and I've tried, who had been very active in Council, believed that the resignation in 1912 of 2,000 of its 12,000 members signaled, in her words, the death knell of what should have been a splendid organization. So into that breach leaped Mrs. Abram Simon. So Carrie Simon had been an active member of the National Council of Jewish Women. The minute she got to Washington, her husband had had pulpits in other cities. She was, by the way, from Cincinnati. The minute she got to Washington, she not only was welcomed by the National Council of Jewish Women, but she became an officer. And of course, where did the council meet? It met in the temple that her husband was called to, the Washington Hebrew congregation, then known as the 8th Street Synagogue. So you can see the old one and then the newer building. And Carrie Simon, in fact, the press talked about Carrie Simon always being interested in all the activities of her husband's congregation. So, so she joins this National Council chapter, but then very quickly, by 1905, she creates a ladies' auxiliary society at Washington Hebrew congregation, because there hadn't been one there yet. And the minutes of that, that meeting recall that there were 50 women at the founding meeting. They pledged themselves to 10-cent dues. They promised to raise money to pay off the mortgage, and then they recessed to polish the doorknobs. You know, sometimes you just can't make this stuff up. It's in the records. So in its first years, what were these women doing? They were doing exactly what all of these other older ladies' Hebrew associations were doing. They were basically being the homemaker at home and the homemaker in the synagogue. And even as they stepped out into this more public space of the synagogue. So Carrie Simon must have sensed, and unfortunately she did not have the kind of historical mind that today you have in terms of creating your records and giving them to the American Jewish Archives, making them available. So we don't really know what was going on, but it seems clear that it's the defections from council that, and then these conversations with these other rabbis' wives, that must have propelled her to begin planning for the creation of NFTS, because the Washington chapter seceded from council in December of 1912. So if she knew that just 2 months later, in February 1912, Hadassah had been founded as what would become a major powerhouse within the American Jewish community, nothing that she would have read about in 1912 would have signified that Hadassah, founded by Henrietta Zold, was going to become a large mass-based organization, because in 1912, here's the original call for the meeting, and in 1912, Hadassah was a tiny little organization meeting chiefly in New York and would not become a mass-based organization and draw in tens of thousands of American Jewish women until the 1920s. So Simon proceeded, and while we don't know exactly how she went about organizing the National Federation, it's clear, especially from the words of Cincinnati's Rabbi David Phillipson, that she was, and I quote, the creator of the Federation. So she was a force, if not the chief force, behind its success. So what strikes me is that the founding meeting of National Federation of Temple Sisterhoods the founding meeting has a surprisingly feminist tone in its remarks, although it never uses the word feminism. So those of us who are sitting here today, well, that actually makes a lot of sense. The word's just coming into use back then. It was, we can actually see how it's being used much, much more frequently in books, thanks to Google, believe it or not. And so they don't use that word, but the tenor of the remarks is clearly, in my opinion, clearly feminist. So those of us who are sitting here today, we know a lot about second wave feminism. Some of us lived through this. We remember President Kennedy's 1961 Commission on the Status of Women in American Life. Just convening the commission said there was a problem. We know that Betty Friedan, Jewish woman, launched a revolution when she published The Feminine Mystique, illuminating the problem that had no name, where, by the way, some of us remember that she said suburban women lived in comfortable concentration camps. We remember that a married woman, even one who earned her own wages, could not get credit at a bank until the 1970s unless her husband co-signed. We remember these: help wanted female, help wanted male, and they were never for the same kinds of jobs. But what we don't know so much about is Jewish women and first wave feminism. First wave feminism, which precedes and then continues after the ratification of the 19th Amendment, granting women the right to vote. So NFTS's birth 7 years before the ratification of the 19th Amendment sits squarely within this first wave of feminism. And we can see here the executive board meeting in 1913. The archives tells us this is actually a pre-convention meeting. What's really interesting is the executive board is not elected until after the convention. I find that kind of interesting. Your executive board might want to keep this photo in front of them. So, and we have the handwritten minutes from this very first meeting. And so again, they weren't videotaping, needless to say, or taking notes on a computer. So at the first meeting, the one address that I have enough time to talk about is the one that Rabbi David Phillipson gave. And you can see Rabbi David Phillipson in this photo. He's on your left, on your far left. He's sitting with other leaders of American Judaism, Solomon Schechter with the beard, and Cyrus Adler, and Dr. Schoolman. So Phillipson's opening remarks addressed what he called the first gathering of delegates of Jewish women's congregational organizations in the history of the world. And he said this moment was only possible because Reform Judaism had placed Jewish women on a plane of religious equality. And then he went on to list all of the Reform milestones. You could actually write a book about just using his list to see how Reform had changed the status of women. So he talked about Abraham Geiger, 1837. Let there be from now on no distinction between duties for men and women. David Einhorn said, it's a sacred duty, and then proclaimed the complete religious equality of woman with man. Isaac Mayer Wise had brought women out of the balcony and down into the family pew. Phillipson then pointed to Reform's other innovations equalizing women's status: women in the choir, girls in the confirmation class, the elimination of the morning benediction where men thanked God who has not made me a woman, counting women in a minyan, right? It would take the conservative movement well more than a century to make that historic step. Only one step remained for women to achieve full equality, according to Phillipson, to become full members of congregations in their own right. That women would want to be rabbis one day was not on his radar screen. He welcomed this new federation to be the counterpart of the Union of American Hebrew Congregations, and he knew that NFTS would forge a mighty weapon in the service of Judaism. So when you read these remarks 100 years later, you can hear the feminism behind them without his using the word. The counterpart, that the NFTS would be the counterpart of the Union, showed that the Reform movement was embracing feminism's notion of gender equality. Didn't have to be in the same organization, but they could be in parallel organizations. That NFTS would forge a mighty weapon in the service of Judaism responded to the new feminisms. Remember, this is the first wave feminism's emphasis on the need for women to join together to develop their feminist consciousness and impel change. So it won't surprise you to know that not everybody shared Rabbi Phillipson's penchant. There was one address that talked about the women are now kind of rising to their duties as mothers in Israel. But the NFTS Constitution, and you quote this in the film that's on your website, the NFTS Constitution looked to the future, and it followed Phillipson's lead. It wrote that this Constitution marked the increased power which has come to the modern American Jewess. Now, Jewess is a term that was often used in the 19th and early 20th centuries to speak of Jewish women. Carrie Simon used it in everything that she wrote. It was often a way of distinguishing, especially between middle and upper class Jewish women and the immigrant Jewish women who were pouring in. So NFTS resolved to harness women's increased power and use it in the temple and beyond. Founding NFTS, Carrie Simon showed that its members, even if they all didn't share her vision, its members were alive to this environment of the percolating feminism that was just kind of bubbling up from below in the 19-teens. And that feminism unleashed a rising expectations for what women could do and achieve if they banded together. So just to kind of locate NFTS in its moment in time. So these are the years when women created a mass-based organization for suffrage, the suffrage parade from New York in 1912. These were the years when tens of thousands of immigrant Jewish women were going out on strike all over America, especially in New York and Philadelphia, Boston, and Chicago. They had been bent over sewing machines and they wanted better conditions. They wanted to better their lives. These were years when housewives in New York and in Providence, Jewish housewives in Providence, Rhode Island, you can see actually that this is a kosher butcher, that they declared war on the kosher butchers and boycotted the rising prices. So American women and Jewish women among them were uniting to work together to find in the power of the organized collective, which is what NFTS became, the possibility to advance their particular interests. NFTS opened up a space for the modern American Jewess. I don't have time to talk about what it did in its first years, but Rabbi Zola is going to give you some insight into that. But I can just tell you briefly that it wanted to quicken the religious consciousness of Israel, that it wanted to do work in the home, the school, and the congregation, and also beyond. It would end up challenging the National Council of Jewish Women. But my colleagues are going to tell us so much more about all of this work later. I just want to show you two more things. The Washington Post reported on the founding of the NFTS, and in this article, it proclaimed it establishes the equality of the Jewish woman in all congregational activities. So let me close with Carrie Simon's words from 1915. Woman is looking around and ahead. She has been told that she was once a slave, an inferior, a minion. But now power, and she capitalized power, undreamed has been placed in her hands, and her scepter will sway from the hovel to the White House. She is only on the first step of the threshold leading to the hall of civic culture and economic influences. Women's emancipation is no longer to be argued. It may be dreaded, deplored, or defied, but it is to be reckoned with. And into that reckoning marched hundreds of thousands of the women of Reform Judaism.